The Undertaker gave a rare sit-down interview with Pastor Ed Young. He is the senior pastor at the Fellowship Church in Texas. Undertaker, of course, lives in Texas. I cannot begin to tell you how many tweets and how many Facebook posts and emails that I received with links to this interview. Don't know if you saw it. Here's the link. Have you seen this? Can you talk about this? I don't know if you've seen this. Here's the link. I wanted to cry. They just wouldn't stop. So obviously this thing got around. It's got over 1 million views now on YouTube. I doubt, many of the other similar types of videos that Pastor Ed Young has done has gotten 1 million views. But I looked at this and I thought to myself, this should have been the interview that he did with Stone Cold for his podcast on the network. Many moons ago, they put a press release out. Steve Austin's going to be interviewing Sting and The Undertaker. I mean, unless I just completely dreamt it, I could have sworn this was actually announced at one point, and then it just never happened. And in fact, we haven't seen a Stone Cold podcast on the network probably since Dean Ambrose. Dean Ambrose ruined the whole thing. That interview was so bad, they haven't done one since. Unless I'm just forgetting one. It certainly was one of the last ones Austin did on the network, if not the last one. But yeah, I just watched it. I thought, man, this would have been super cool if it was actually Stone Cold doing the interview and they had the full hour on the network to just sit and shoot the shit with The Undertaker. They could talk about their own matches and their own feud in the Attitude Era and a bunch of other things. So I thought it was a missed opportunity, but it was still cool. We don't get to see Undertaker very often in this type of environment. The last time I could remember him sitting down for a shoot type of, I say shoot, like out of character interview is the one he did in 2002 before WrestleMania 18. They were up in Canada and he was in the arena. They were filming an episode of the Michael Landsberg Off the Record show. And you can still find it on YouTube. And again, that was probably only 20 minutes, half an hour maybe, which is about the length of what this was. This was about half an hour. But you got to think that Undertaker has so many stories and just so many tales to tell. You could get hours out of this guy. And I'll say this, Ed Young, I don't know of him. He may be a good pastor. He's a pretty bad interviewer. A few times he cut The Undertaker off in the middle of a sentence. Undertaker himself, honestly, the first 10 minutes of this really weren't that good. He rambled a lot at the beginning. But it's so rare to see him do this sort of thing that it's worth tolerating those first 10 minutes just to get to the good stuff. Now, a lot of it was stories that I've heard before, like, him getting that first phone call from Vince McMahon. Are you my Undertaker? I'm your Undertaker. We've heard that story before. How that has never been reenacted as a beer commercial with those two, I'll never know. But he talked about a few other things I had not heard before. So he talked about Andre the Giant and the match that never was. Because I think Ed Young asked him, did you ever wrestle Andre? And that triggered a story that he remembered, which is that Andre had taken a liking to him. And once said to him, you and me, boss, I've got an idea. For what they would do together in a program or in a match. But he never told Undertaker what the idea was. He tried to get it out of him. Andre just wouldn't tell him. But he said, I got an idea for us, boss. So he tried to get the answer Undertaker did out of Tim White. Tim White was good friends with Andre. I think he was kind of his handler in many ways. And, former WWF referee. And Tim White didn't know. So he didn't know what Andre had in mind. Andre didn't tell anybody what his idea was. And The Undertaker, to this very day, still wonders what the idea was that Andre had for. Now, Andre passed away before it could happen. It wasn't happening anyway, because by that point, his health was so bad. I mean, Andre's health was in such decline that there's no way that would have ever happened anyway. But Taker and Andre is one of those fantasy matchups that, when I was younger and I would read all the old WWF magazines, they constantly would have like fantasy warfare matchups. And that was one that would come up from time to time. Andre and Undertaker, what would happen, if the two of them had a match? To me, the real dream match with those two would have been Andre, young Andre, from the 70s, the Andre who moved around like a lightweight sometimes. Andre back then was so agile. I mean, I was on YouTube one day and I fell down the rabbit hole. This was around the time that the Andre documentary hit HBO. So I was on YouTube and I was watching a bunch of Andre the Giant clips and some Andre the Giant match highlights. And I stumbled on a lot of his old stuff from the 70s, and I was just mesmerized watching this because you forget. I mean, when I grew up, Andre was already past his prime. He wasn't as bad as he got in the late 80s, but he was already on a downward trajectory at that point physically. And unless you grew up in the 60s and the 70s and went to the old Madison Square Garden shows in the 70s when Bruno was still active and, Bob Backlund and Billy Graham and Pedro Morales and guys like that, you don't know or you forget how good of a big man Andre really was, how quick he could be, how light on his feet he could be, the moves that he would do. There was one video I came across that Andre, now I don't remember if he was giving it or taking it, but there was a video of Andre, I think he might have been giving somebody a version of a Canadian destroyer. I mean, the things that he was doing back then was unbelievable. So what I would have loved to have seen was that version of Andre against like the mid to late 2000s version of The Undertaker. The Undertaker who was cranking out better matches than he did when he was 10 years younger. That would have been a hell of a match. You talk about a fantasy matchup? That would have been a fantasy matchup. So he talked about that. He talked about his injuries. He's had both eye sockets crushed. I knew of one. I know he had his orbital bone, I think it was fractured or shattered by Mabel. Mabel gave him a leg drop in 95. I think it was on an episode of Raw. And it crushed his orbital bone. That's why he had to wear that Phantom of the Opera type mask for a few months into the beginning of 96. So I knew about that. I didn't know that he had the other one crushed. He said he's had about 20 different orthopedic type surgeries throughout his career. He confirmed that both hips have now had some form of a hip replacement. It sounded like not a full-on hip replacement. That may come when he's actually retired, which will never happen. But he's had some form of a hip replacement already done. Probably why he's been moving around a little bit better this year than he was when we saw him last year. I mean, there was a noticeable difference when he came back for the match with Cena at WrestleMania this year compared to the way he was moving for the match with Roman Reigns last year. He talked about torn biceps, torn triceps, torn pecs. He was getting into some other injuries when the interviewer cut him off. One of the many times he got cut off during this interview. But the thing that got the most play were his comments about the younger wrestlers and the advice that he gives them. So this is what The Undertaker said. He said, "I am a firm believer in less is more, especially with my character. And when I talk to young guys, they think, okay, well, I can do. And athletes today," he says, "they're off the chart. They're just ridiculous how athletically gifted the men and women are, for that matter. But they rely," he said, "see, wrestling and sports entertainment is not about the moves. It really isn't. It's about being able to evoke emotion in one facet or another. You have to either make people love you or you have to make them hate you. Either way, and it doesn't matter really which one, but you have to make them feel something. Certainly people like to be hated and certain people like to be loved. But if you cannot bring that emotion out of your audience, you're not going to have them for very long." And a lot of times what happens with the young guys is they're so athletic, they're so gifted, they'll do some kind of double crazy backflip off the top rope, land on somebody on the floor, and that's what the audience takes away from it. This guy does crazy stuff. Well, you can only see that so many times before you say, well, I've seen that, I need something new. And he said that's a double backflip full gainer onto somebody. How do I up that? And that's the position they sometimes back themselves into. It's like they have to keep upping the ante. And when you up the ante like that, then you increase your potential for injuries and catastrophic injuries at that. So he continued on just a little bit more here. He said, "Characters like The Rock and Cena and Ric Flair, all those guys like that, they had the ability to make you love them or make you hate them. And Cena is such an anomaly because you don't know one night to the next whether they're going to go ballistically crazy for him or they're going to boo him out of the building. He's probably the most polarizing guy that's come along in a long time. His fan base is crazy. But what happens is he sells tickets. He works in front of full arenas. Same thing with Rock when he was here. But that's the key. We tell stories. We use moves. The wrestling moves help tell the story. But it boils down to character and being able to bring that emotion out of your audience. There's a lot of guys, it takes a while to figure that part out, and by the time they do, they're so beat up and injured and hurt that their career is basically over at that point. So the gist of what he's saying is wrestling isn't really about the wrestling. It's not about the moves. It's not about the holds. It's about the character. It's about the stories. And in that, he is 100% absolutely right. He is 100% right. The other thing he's right about, he made another comment. He said about the current guys that he sees, the younger guys, he says they're trying to emulate or be like a wrestler they watched on TV instead of being the wrestler that is on TV. And I think that's another great point that he made. Now, not everybody does that. I don't think we should be painting all of the current guys with that brush, but are there guys who will watch The Rock or will watch Roddy Piper and will sometimes blatantly lift things from them? Of course that happens. But there's also nothing wrong with watching, and I think, I would have to think that most of the older guard would encourage the younger guys to study tapes and to watch the older stars like Ric Flair, like Roddy Piper, and study what worked and what didn't, what made them so special, and then take from that and borrow from that. Maybe not blatantly. You don't have to use the exact lines they used in promos, but I would think that they would encourage people to go back and study what worked for those guys, what made those guys so, legendary and just what made them such big stars, and just try to weave that into what they do. But he's right. You've got to, people will email me a lot and they'll say, who do you think is the next Stone Cold? Who's the next Hogan? How come WWE hasn't created the next Hogan? Who's the next Rock? And I always say, if I was a young guy on the WWE roster or the NXT roster, and I'm the big up-and-comer, and everybody's talking and buzzing about me, and they're saying, hey, this guy, they said that about Dean Ambrose. When Dean Ambrose got hot for a period there a couple years ago, they said, he's going to be the next Stone Cold. And then, ironically, he did the Stone Cold podcast, and it seemed like it was all downhill from there. But it's so unfair to them, because how can you possibly fill those shoes? It's like if you're the son or the daughter of this legendary wrestler, Charlotte is going to she's already doing well, and Charlotte is going to go on and do very well for herself. So she's one of the examples of somebody who I think will be fine, but you can point to a lot of, third generation sons of wrestlers who have tried to make a name for themselves, and they may be very gifted and they may be very talented as a wrestler, but they're immediately handicapped because, oh, you're the son of so-and-so. Dustin Rhodes, oh, you're the son of the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. David Flair, oh, he's Ric Flair's son, right? Greg Gagne is the son of Vern Gagne, and on, and there's tons of others that you can point to. Eric Watts, right? So it's tough. If you're in that position, it's tough because you're immediately being compared to somebody who's so great that maybe physically you're more gifted than they were, but there's no way that you can match their status. All you can do is just try to blaze your own path, and immediately you're handicapped. So I get emails like that, and I feel badly for them. Or they'll say, who's the next Stone Cold? I say, well, they don't need to worry about being the next Stone Cold. Let us make the comparisons if we see there's some sort of similarity there. People have been joking Stone Cold Becky Lynch, but it's not like Becky Lynch is going out there flipping people off and trying to mimic Stone Cold. She's doing her own thing and it's working for her. But to say, oh, so-and-so is going to be the next Undertaker, you can't do that. He's right. You have to not worry about being the next so-and-so or let me be like this guy. Be your own guy. Find something that works for you and create your own legacy. It's part of the reason maybe why we don't have very many stars now who feel as big as the stars of 20 years ago. When Undertaker came along in the 90s, were there people comparing him to somebody else? I don't remember those comparisons. He became the Undertaker. There's only one Undertaker. Stone Cold came along. Were there people comparing him to any one particular person? No. Not that I can remember. He became Stone Cold Steve Austin. He may have borrowed the beer drinking and stuff from the Sandman, but he created his own character. There was nobody saying, "Oh, he's trying to be this guy." So I think Undertaker was making total sense here in this interview. I don't think he was knocking the guys who do a lot of the crazy moves, that you may see in the cruiserweight matches or in some New Japan matches or Ring of Honor matches. He's simply saying that that's not really what wrestling is all about. If you believe that wrestling is about storytelling, then the moves are just there to enhance the story. The story and the character are the most important thing. Think back to some of the greatest angles and storylines in WWE history if you're a WWE fan, right? The Mega Powers, Macho Man and Hulk Hogan. It wasn't about moves. It wasn't about matches. They told over the period of over a year really, this great story. It's still to this day one of the all-time great, if not the best storyline I think they ever did. Austin versus McMahon, was it about the matches? Was it about the moves? It didn't have to be. I mean, the stunner was over like crazy, but it wasn't about that. It was about the story of the evil boss trying to fuck with the top babyface. And the top babyface just so happened to be the everyman that people could relate to. He drinks beer, he cusses, he's just like me. And they told this great story of Vince at every step trying to take the title from him, trying to screw him every which way. These are simple, basic stories here. The Undertaker and Kane story. So he's right. I don't really see anything wrong at all in what Undertaker said in this interview. I thought it was sage advice. And I'd like to hear more from him because he's a guy that's been around forever. He's seen it all. He's worked with everybody. He's reinvented his own character a bunch of different times, from the dead man to the badass, back to the dead man. The ministry taker who spoke in tongues. Whatever this current version of The Undertaker is, he was talking smack to Shawn Michaels the other day, pointing his finger in his face. So I would like to hear him, speak more openly about these types of things. I don't need to see him on Twitter or anything like that. He's already got an Instagram. That's enough. His Instagram is a trip, by the way, some of the pictures that he posts. But I thought it was, for what it was, I thought it was a great interview. I thought that there was a lot to unpack there, but I saw a lot of debate about whether or not, do you agree with what he said, and is Undertaker, bashing the current generation? He spoke the truth. There was nothing in what he said that was untrue.